Great, thanks. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Government, an institution I'm very fond of myself, having been very involved in its early days. It's great to have you all here today, and fantastic to have Cass Sunstein. There's a tiny bit of background, of course. In the UK in 2010, the coalition government set up the Behavioural Insight Team, essentially to use many of the kind of ideas around nudge and behavioural economics in the UK context. We were very much following in the footsteps of Cass, both institutionally and intellectual, in the sense that the book, actually I have it here as a little prompt, of course we all know and love, from 2008. But by that time, of course, Cass was actually in the White House, or in the Eisenhower building, doing it, actually. And so I also have a particular thanks that even before we set up the Behavioural Insight Team, and I was in Washington, and Cass was very kind, and we exchanged thoughts about how we might do this and how it would work. And of course, the Institute itself was involved, and with Gus, at the tail end of the previous administration, in the Mindspace report, and I think I saw Paul Dolan also, he's here somewhere, but maybe next door, and to try and have an early go at setting out how you might use this in a policy-making process. But it was really with the coalition government in the UK where we started to use it at scale. And essentially, it's been, I mean, let's face it, I think Gus would probably agree, people were pretty skeptical early on in 2010 in the UK. I mean, what was this stuff, and was it a gimmick? And for 2 years, 2.5 years now, really since, we've had a fantastic sort of run of actually particularly doing experiments, I mean, the right thing to do, but also help to persuade people who were skeptical to say actually making these often seemingly very small changes to policies, to processes actually as much as policies, could often be incredibly consequential. We sort of thought it would be important, but actually it turns out to be really remarkable. So we worked in many areas. Of course, you've got the big change coming through anyway on pensions, the change of default, which we know is just enormously consequential, an issue which we've wrestled with for literally decades in many countries, where to try and drive up the savings rate, and just changing the default from an opt-in to an opt-out is just hugely consequential, and is already bringing in, well, literally it'll bring in millions of extra people to have savings. We've done it around tax, small changes in letters, you know, just telling people something about their neighbours, that they're more virtuous than they thought they were. Most people pay their tax on time. Turned out to be an incredibly effective way to get people to pay rapidly. On green issues, like getting people to insulate their homes. On consumer markets, incredibly important area where often you can get a stable equilibrium, but actually a lot of consumer detriment. And so giving consumers the ability to get access to their data in machine-readable form. So you can try and work out when your phone company says to you, you're definitely on the best tariff. And rather than going through the fact that there are 7 million odd phone tariff combinations, actually you can just download your data and you should be able to figure it out. Someone will do the math for you, kind of thing. So that's in the enterprise bill. And of course, growth is the biggest one of all. Well, actually, I mean, it applies in lots of issues. It's not, I mean, it's just small things. It turns out it's lots of things. So the choices that you make, do you go to university, do you not? Can we pre-fill a form, make it easier for you? Does a firm decide to take on an extra employee? We can cut labour taxes, of course, they're in the budget, but also can we just make it easier? If you just make it easier to pay someone or take them on, how consequential will that be? And in all these areas, we see huge effects. So just turning to Cass then. Cass, I think, is a remarkable scholar. Actually, I think I've been lucky, I feel, to have worked in the academic and the government world, but the people who really stand out, I think they tend to do so for 3 reasons. One, they bring genuinely fresh approaches and thinking to an area, and especially for me, if there's empirical content to it. And though many people in the UK know Cass's work on nudge, but actually he's been an astonishingly prolific author in many areas, such as going to extremes, looking at how the polarizations occurred in essentially in US voter and public opinion, and how it gets reinforced in various kinds of ways. Availability cascades, one of the things we talk about in that area. So incredibly fresh thinking. It's cut lots of boundaries. I mean, you're a lawyer, right? But actually, you write in so many other areas too. It's a really remarkable and very fresh. And then, of course, for me too, you do the third thing that gets the real, the extra stars, is to also apply it in the real world, not to be satisfied to use it in the academy, but actually say, you know, where does this go to? So it's fantastic to have you here. It's just the last comment I'll just make, just to you all be aware, it's a slightly unusual format. The discussion today is going to be recorded for, I think, Radio 4 analysis, particularly. So Cass is going to present some material in sort of 20 minutes or so. And then the discussion, though, is going to be recorded. So two things. One, bear that in mind if there's something you want to say, for one way or the other. Not sure how it might affect your behaviour, but that's an interesting thought. Absolutely, possibly in my own case. But also, just a very practical point then, because it is being recorded in that second half, if you think you need to go, either could you just duck out a little bit early and you can watch next door, or go out very, very quietly, I think would be the point. Is that what you need to know?
That would be great.
Exactly. Very good. Otherwise, over to you. Oh, well, I should have said I didn't do it, did I? Of course. I'm sure I'll say it. Of course, Cass's latest book, which is partly we're all... This is why I'm not on TV. Okay, very good.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. I've watched and been able a bit to collaborate on questions with David and his team, and it's been an inspiration to see their work. It's really phenomenal and a model for many nations, as is increasingly being recognized throughout the world. I'll tell you a little bit about my job for nearly 4 years, and then get to some of the things we did and some of the things that might be done. There's an office, a small office called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. I was administrator of that office, and it was created in the 1980s, and it's a veto point over federal rules. So to issue a rule involving the environment or education or immigration or national security or healthcare, it has to be approved by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. The fact that the office has a veto authority, which is subject to appeal to the president, of course, but the fact that it has a veto authority gives it a role, along with many others, in trying to shape federal regulation in a way that is helpful rather than harmful to the public. And that's the basic job, and now I'll tell you a little bit about the content. That's me before I started in the government. People used to confuse me with Brad Pitt a lot, and he's actually a lot shorter than I am, so, but otherwise we looked very similar. I don't know if you know the movie Moneyball or the book Moneyball, but the basic idea in the book is that evidence beats intuitions, and even people who are economically motivated, like baseball teams, maybe rely on intuitions and anecdotes and ought to get more statistical. So here's an idea which helped guide me toward regulatory Moneyball. So as statistical analysis is to baseball, maybe evidentiary foundations and statistical analysis would be to regulations. So think of this dialogue, you can generalize it easily to cricket or football and maybe even to policy. The guy's an athlete, Bill, the old scout says. There's a lot of upside there. He can't hit, says Billy. He's not that bad a hitter, says the old scout. Paul, who's the statistics analyst, reads what the player's batting actually was like. My only question, says Billy, if he's that good a hitter, why doesn't he hit better? Over and over, the old scouts will say the guy has a great body, or this guy may be the best body in the draft. And every time they do, Billy will say, we're not selling jeans here, and deposit yet another highly touted player beloved by the scouts onto his bad list, his not-to-do list. Okay, in part because the economy has been struggling in the United States and elsewhere, and in part because of a general prudential attitude toward government regulation, I was charged with paying very careful attention to costs and benefits. And here's regulatory Moneyball, you're witnessing it. Under President Bush, the net benefits of rules after 3 fiscal years was in excess of $3 billion. That's an achievement. Billions of dollars in benefits are good to deliver, and President Bush did that. Clinton, primarily because of air pollution rules, did a bit better. He was around $14 billion in net benefits. The Obama administration, through 3 fiscal years, is over 25 times the Bush number and over 6 times the Clinton number, $91 billion, a little bit north of that. And by the time the accounting is done of the 4th fiscal year, it's going to look a lot higher than $91 billion. Okay, very high net benefits, motivated and made possible by an insistent focus on what are things costing and what are the benefits looking like. Okay, that $91 billion is an abstraction, and what is its human meaning? Well, it includes billions of dollars in savings for consumers made possible by cost-sensitive energy efficiency and fuel economy rules. You may have seen that fuel economy in the United States is ramping up. That is net beneficial, very big benefits for consumers who are saving money at the pump. Some of that 91 billion reflects not easily monetized savings, but the fact that lots of lives are being saved and lots of illnesses and accidents are being prevented as a result of rules involving, for example, air pollution and traffic safety. Food safety too. So there are big improvements on those counts from the United States. And there are billions of dollars in economic savings for businesses, achieved in part through deregulation. And I'll talk a little bit about that subcategory of regulatory moneyball. Okay, here are 4 concepts, and I think at least 3 I think will be familiar. The word simpler is not itself a challenging concept. And so we were alert to the fact that complexity is harmful, and sometimes more harmful than is anticipated. And so an idea was to try to make things intelligible and understandable and easily navigated. Nudge, you know about. The idea is libertarian paternalism, influencing people's choices, but allowing them to go their own way. An educational campaign is a form of a nudge if it informs people about the risks of distracted driving, for example. But if people say, you know, I don't care what you're educating me about, I'm going to do what I want to do, a nudge by itself is not going to prevent that. The idea of choice architecture is that just as a building has an architecture, so any decision we make has an architecture behind it. If you enter a grocery store, there's sometimes a self-conscious choice architecture in the form of design. And if you go into a government office or an office where you're going to get a tablet or a computer, there's an architecture there that will influence your choices. So choice architecture is pervasive, and there's just no avoiding it. Any efforts to avoid it will fail because the avoidance itself embeds a choice architecture. Okay, human errors. Do you all know the gorilla study of the invisible gorilla? Shall I tell you about the invisible gorilla? There's a gorilla standing behind me and you didn't even notice. No, that's not true. There's no gorilla standing behind me. The basic idea for those who don't know the study, and I was subject to it, is that if people are asked to do a task, which is to compute passes, calculate passes of basketball on a little basketball court, and a gorilla comes across the court in the middle and kind of goes, a significant percentage of people, myself included, don't notice the gorilla, and actually are stunned to hear that there was a gorilla in the field, and don't find it credible. Our attention is limited. We also tend to be systematically over-optimistic. In fact, the only demographic group that is not victim to unrealistic optimism is the clinically depressed. They have a sense of reality. People don't deal great with probability and sometimes neglect the long term in a way that can cause big problems. Danny Kahneman has publicized and elaborated an idea which I think is extremely helpful, which is that the human brain has in it, we're speaking metaphorically now, but it's a helpful metaphor, 2 cognitive systems. One is automatic, effortless, and fast. Another is deliberative, calculative, and slow. If you are told about crime in your neighborhood, your system 1 might be activated such that you stay home that night, even though your system 2 might think the actual statistical risk is really low, and it's a form of excessive precaution that keeps you home. Sometimes system 1 doesn't get activated by risks that are actually sizable, including risks of financial problems over the long term, and we need to strengthen the hand of system 2 to ensure prudent precautions. Should I tell you a little basketball story? Larry Bird is a great basketball player, played in Massachusetts, and he was an exceptional 3-point shooter. could shoot from long distance and do well. But he wasn't the best three-point shooter, not by any means. And at the basketball all-star game, the first three-point contest, he went up to one of the very best three-point shooters and said to him, "Your motion's a little bit different. What are you doing differently these days?" Of course, it wasn't true, but it was disruptive to the indispensable system one of the shooter. And then he added to the shooter, "These balls we're using for this competition, they're slippery, aren't they? It's hard kind of to hold on to the ball." That was also not true. But that player ended up last in the competition. Bird won because he undermined system one. The more interesting finding, I think, for our purposes, is that some of the cognitive errors to which human beings are prey disappear when people are speaking in a foreign language. If we conducted this session in French or German, supposing you are not completely familiar with those languages but have some facility, it's likely that some of the cognitive errors that have been emphasized by behavioral economists will disappear. The reason for that, I think, on reflection, isn't puzzling. It's that our automatic intuitive judgments are disabled when we're working in a foreign language. Our cognition is very much with us. Excuse us, my system 2 is telling me, as is my system 1, that I should have a drink, non-alcoholic. Such that with the foreign language, system 2 is operating, system 1 isn't, and we don't err. I think of cost-benefit analysis as a kind of nudge for the nudgers, or a kind of choice architecture for choice architects that gets them thinking in system 2 fashion, gets them focused on evidence and data rather than anecdotes and snap judgments. Okay. General principles. These are very much fitting with the work of the Behavioral Insights team. If you're thinking about regulatory interventions, in the case of doubt at least, make it automatic, simple, intuitive, meaningful, and don't strain system 2. People are busy. They have a lot of things to worry about, their families, their job, their future. If government can work to make things easily comprehensible and meaningful and intuitive, that's very good. Ease and simplicity are often going to deliver big benefits. In areas that range from obesity to health to energy, traffic safety, and more, these principles are helpful organizers. Okay, we spent a lot of time on simple disclosure as a nudge. And as a way of getting at separation of sensible from senseless policies, I want to just fix, if I can, on one change we made in the Obama administration. Here's the old United States Department of Agriculture food pyramid, which was a much visited icon, a torment for educators, children, and parents for many years. Think to yourself, what should you eat if you're studying the food pyramid? There's someone, male or female, walking to the top of the pyramid where there's a little white triangle. Is that heaven or thinness? What's so good about that? There's a bunch of foods kind of bunched together here at the bottom. Are you supposed to eat all of them? There's one that looks like a shoe, and the person doesn't. Is it good to eat a shoe? Is that nutritious? So the response to the food pyramid was not excellent in terms of healthy behavior, just because it's baffling. Here's the new U.S. Department of Agriculture food plate. It's much simpler. It basically says make half your plate fruits and vegetables, and you're most of the way home. So I had a big picture in my office of the food plate as a constant reminder of the following mantra, which I hope now will be intelligible: plate, not pyramid. Plate, not pyramid, as a way of organizing how government should deal respectfully with its citizens. Be clear and straightforward. Don't baffle people. Okay, there's our old fuel economy label, which is, what does this mean? Why is this good to have 3023? We replaced it with something which gives people something that's meaningful. Economic savings over 5 years, an annual fuel cost. disclosure policy that System 1 can immediately grasp rather than having to try to work through. For health insurance, we're trying to make the market work better, introduce greater competition, and also enable consumer choice through a summary of benefits and coverage. So people don't have to struggle through zillions of pages to figure out what they're getting. I gather you have something like this here, graphic warnings, and forgive me for the graphic nature of the warnings. This is an effort to target System 1 directly. David referred to automatic enrollment, which is an, I think, underexploited and just starting to be recognized tool for affecting policy. And David's quite right to emphasize the largeness of the initiative. There's a recent study in Denmark which I think puts what he said in very bold letters. It suggests that automatic enrollment in a savings plan has a significantly larger effect than even big tax incentives. It's worth pausing over that because automatic enrollment is essentially costless. The government doesn't have to spend any money, and yet it boosts dramatically savings rates. If, by contrast, you incentivize savings by giving people tax credits or tax deductions or bonuses or rewards, the effect is more modest. And there's a lesson there for a potential policy tool in multiple areas where behavior can be influenced on the cheap through a default rule. You don't have to worry about taxpayer money or even private regulation. Default rule. Okay, opt-in versus opt-out can make all the difference. Here's an example of one of the many things we did. There are a number of children in the United States who are poor and eligible for school meals, breakfast and lunch, but they don't get them because their parents don't sign them up. The parents don't sign them up partly because the forms are complicated and take time, and partly because poor people tend to be pretty busy and a lot of things to worry over. What we found out was that the government has enough information to know who the eligible kids are, just from other programs, and made them automatically eligible, like that. Directly eligible. They didn't have to sign up. And one part of this direct certification program, as it's called, one small part, is giving up to 260,000 children meals to which they're entitled, which they weren't otherwise getting. Okay, simplification, we know, is a helpful nudge. And one thing we did, part of my last weeks in government, was to direct, there's directive authority, all agencies that impose significant paperwork and reporting burdens on people to eliminate the millions of hours in burdens. By the way, the total number of hours in reporting and paperwork burdens on the American public is about 9 billion hours. If you took all of the citizens of a large city, larger than Philadelphia or San Francisco, and put each and every one into a new city called Paperwork Town, and asked them to work 10 hours a day, weekends included, every day on government forms, by the end of the year, that city will still have spent much less time on paperwork than the American public does a year. So it's a big priority to reduce hours. In January, it was announced quietly that we've eliminated 100 million hours in annual burdens, which is, I think, the biggest reduction in American history. Okay, I bet you're aware of the immense power of social norms in affecting behavior. If people know that they're spending more money on energy than their neighbors, levels of energy use decrease. So a simple report that tells people how much they're spending compared to their neighbors can have big effects in reducing energy use in a way that's both environmentally beneficial and economically beneficial for them. In the United States, seatbelt usage has experienced a quiet revolution over the last decades, from about 11% in the early 1980s to well over 80% now. It may be up over 90, and that's been produced in large part by changing social norms. The problem of obesity is a significant concern for First Lady Michelle Obama, as well as others in the administration. It's kind of her signature initiative. And her focus has not been on regulatory requirements, but instead working closely with the private sector and trying to activate emerging social norms to make children particularly healthier. And if you look at the data up here from Walmart and other companies, the progress has been truly remarkable, and not a result of top-down mandates, but instead private-public interaction. Okay, speaking of choice architecture for choice architects, one of my principal goals was to ensure that the government would benefit from the dispersed knowledge of the American people, and that we wouldn't go forward with stuff that might be imperfect until we had heard what people had to say. So there's a website called regulations.gov. It's irresistible and addictive, so if you get on it, watch out, you're never going to get out. And that let your voice be heard, which occasionally appears on the screen, that's not just happy talk, it's meant. Rules are changed and improved every day as a result of what's learned about inadequacies in what's proposed. Data.gov is a website, I know you have an analog here, that puts hundreds of thousands of data sets out to the public, and they are being used to develop countless apps. The Department of Transportation recently announced one that involves matters of great importance to motorists. Okay, David also referred to what we call smart disclosure, which is an idea of releasing to consumers information relating to them in downloadable, machine-readable formats so that they can actually know about their own choices and figure out how they might be made better in the future. In the area of health and energy use, millions of people in the United States are now benefiting from smart disclosure. I'm going to close by talking about what might be the most ambitious reform step in the regulatory area taken in the Obama administration. So there's an executive order which is binding law on the agencies. It has the delightful name, Executive Order 13563, right? That sticks in the head. You're never going to get that out of your head, 13563. And the document sets out regulatory requirements that govern the federal government. So it's a little like a mini constitution for regulation. And it emphasizes cost-benefit analysis, regulatory moneyball. It emphasizes flexible approaches, including appropriate default rules, so there's a reference to that. It emphasizes, very importantly, the centrality of scientific integrity, including social science integrity, in a way that separates that enterprise from the political enterprise. Political judgments are one thing, scientific and factual judgments are another. Makes a clear declaration of that. But most dramatically, it requires that evidence-based judgment be iterated, meaning that once rules are on the books, we don't declare victory and closure and go on to the next step. We reevaluate them and streamline or modify or repeal them if that's what the reevaluation suggests. So it's continuing scrutiny of rules on the books. That's I think, the signature achievement of the president's first term in the regulatory domain. Okay, here are the results. In a hurry, over 24 agencies, which is to say every single agency that was bound by the executive order, released a reform plan, including over 580 initiatives. So that's pretty dramatic stuff to get in a matter of months, 580 initiatives. It was preceded by public comment. We already have a very early accounting, which is that in the next 5 years, we're going to have upwards of $10 billion in savings. And considering that the annual regulatory toll on the American public for new regulations isn't a lot higher than that, the removal of costs is a big deal. Just as one illustration, the Department of Health and Human Services, which is sometimes criticized for piling on regulatory requirements in the interest of safety, I think astonished a large number of people in the medical community by taking away a long series of requirements imposed on them, providing 5-year savings in excess of $5 billion. So thus far, that's our prize winner, but there's a lot more. Over 100 million hours of paperwork burdens are either gone or going to be gone in the near future. Some of that is going to be felt by taxpayers in the next couple of weeks, where things are simpler. So that's our initial catalog of results. Thanks.